Chapter 6, Lesson 2, The History of Canada. It's going to be found on page 184 and 185 in your textbook. Mr. Shane has some resources in front of him using his computer or his actual physical textbook. The textbook page would be in this Chapter 6, Lesson 2 portion. If you click on the headphones, you can listen to the reading that we're going to go through together. You would also have your online PDF, which is a manipulated document which you can edit. You put your name in here, add the different sections and notes. In the first section, as we read about the First Nations of Canada, it asks us to complete the concept web. So the different ideas that are surrounding this all relate back to the central or main idea that you're going to hear about in our reading. There are 1, 2, 3 of those. In the second section, we're going to learn about the exploration and settlement of Canada and make some comparisons to the United States. Here you're going to fill it out as a true or false answer to each of these questions. It says use your textbook to decide if each statement is true or false. If the statement is false, rewrite it correctly. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at how Canada has grown and united to become a large and prosperous nation. With that being said, let's jump into our lesson for today. Our objectives: to describe the ways of life of the First Nations of Canada, explain how exploration and settlement changed Canada, and to describe westward expansion in Canada and growth in the 1900s. Let's begin. The First Nations. In the United States, the Aboriginal or Native peoples who lived in North America before Europe are called Native Americans. Canadians call them First Nations. Coming to Canada. The first people to arrive in Canada came from Asia. They came during a period of intense cold called the Ice Age. The first groups to arrive moved south because Canada was covered with ice. Over thousands of years, though, Earth's climate warmed. The ice sheets over most of Canada melted. As Canada warmed, people occupied the land there. Their way of life depended on the resources where they lived. Different ways of life. The peoples of the eastern woodlands lived by farming, hunting, and fishing. They built villages where they lived for most of the year. They traded with one another. Two important eastern groups were the Huron and the Iroquois. The two nations were rivals and often fought. The peoples of the Pacific coast lived in the region of plenty. Rivers and the waters of the Pacific Ocean provided fish and sea mammals. They hunted game animals in the forest. They used wood from the region's trees to make houses. They also made ocean-going canoes, which they could use to hunt and fish. Life was more difficult in the far north. There, people like the Inuit had to find food in land where few plants grow. Shelters had to be built without using trees. They had to protect themselves from the fierce cold. They hunted caribou, a large animal related to a deer, on land and sea, and seals and whales on the water. Caribou skins were used to make clothing and shoes to keep them warm in the winter. Here's a picture of what maybe a modern day celebration of that culture looks like in Canada. Very similar to the United States in terms of when this place was going to be explored and settled, that there were people that were already living here. And if you look at your notes from this section, you're going to find out that there are 3 distinct areas where these people are hailing from, and because the geography in those locations, the climate in those regions is very different, there are 3 different ways of life for those people. So to sum up what we learned, as the ice sheets over Canada melted, people came from Asia and settled in this region. The early people of Canada hunted, farmed, and fished, and the early people who lived in the far north had fewer resources to work and had to work diligently to keep warm and stay alive. So there were 3 different areas that were described. The first, those that hunted and fished, they lived in villages, traded with one another, the Huron and Iroquois. This was a reference to the people of the eastern woodlands, where these 2 major tribes existed. That was the first paragraph on page 184, where it talked about different ways of life. In the next section, it talked about hunting and fishing sea mammals in rivers in the Pacific Ocean. So this must be, as it gives us information here, the Pacific Ocean all the way to the west. So these are the peoples of the Pacific coast. You'll notice they're different in terms of their hunting, but they're hunting probably different game and having different wildlife that's living there based on the climate and the topography or the geography of what's there. Because they're in a plentiful forest area, they used wood as one of the major resources for houses and canoes. In the last section describes those that are not in the east or the west, but the final paragraph on the top of page 185 talked about those that had few plant and tree resources because they're way far to the north. They had to hunt caribou, seals, and whales in this really cold, frigid region. They had to build shelters without trees and protect themselves from that extreme cold. So this is going to be the people from the far north. Notice in all three of those examples, there are distinct ways of life that these people experience based on where they lived. Now, next thing I'd like to look at is a comparison between the United States and Canada. Because as we read about the exploration and settlement, it's going to be important to tap into our background knowledge of what we already understand as the history of the United States. As settlers from Europe come to the United States, they find out that there are those First Nations or those Native American peoples here. Once they start to settle this region and develop this region, it's going to be very similar to that of Canada in the way in which the country becomes kind of taken over by this European colonization. Now, there are some things that throughout the development of history in the United States and Canada that are different, but there are also some things that are very similar. Let's take a look at those. In Canada, they have a monarch or prime minister, where we have a president of the United States, so the way in which government was set up is a little bit different, as we'll read. They have a national health care system where we have more privatized health care, where you have to have your own insurance, and there are different hospitals that are different companies that are providing that type of health care, where in Canada it's provided by the government. There are two official languages in Canada. They're speaking English because of the settlement of the British in this region, and as we're going to learn, the also prominent settlement of the French. So the two languages that they speak are English and French. Here in the United States, we just speak English as the predominant language. There are other people that speak multiple languages or are bilingual, but the overall language itself is English. In the United States, the things that we have similar to Canada is that they are both big on immigration. There are a lot of people that are traveling and wanting to live in these countries because of the freedoms that they afford. They're both settled by British colonial heritage, so the British came and settled and developed these cities and then turned those cities into larger expanses and eventually nations, gaining their independence from Britain. They believed in westward expansion, so the east was the first portion, the east coast was the first portion that was settled, and that movement expanded west. There were major gold rushes in both the United States and Canada, and they both have what is called a democratic government. Exploration and settlement. Now in this section, we're going to fill out true and false questions as we go. The first Europeans to reach what is now Canada were Vikings. They began their travels around AD 1000 and settled in southern Newfoundland. They soon abandoned their settlement and left. However, more than 500 years later, other Europeans came to the Americas. Number one, the first Europeans who came to Canada were French. We would say that that is false, that they were Vikings. Number two says the French settlement was founded in Quebec. Let's take a look. The next Europeans to explore Canada were the French. An explorer named Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. He claimed the St. Lawrence and the lands around it to France. The whole area of French control eventually was called New France. Number two is true. Number three, French settlers survived by trading with native peoples and by farming. Let's take a look. In the 1600s, the French made the first serious effort to settle the region. Explorer Samuel de Champlain founded the first French settlement in 1608. Over time, more French settlers migrated to Canada. Some became fur traders. These fur traders exchanged European goods with the Huron, a First Nation people. The French received beaver furs that could be shipped back to Europe. Some settlers were priests. They came to Canada to minister to the French settlers who were Roman Catholic. They also hoped to convert native peoples to Christianity. Some settlers farmed. Their crops fed the other settlers. First settlers were traders. Number three is true. British Canada. Page 186. France was a powerful nation in the 1600s and 1700s and had a rival for a power, however. Britain competed with France in the Americas. In the late 1600s, some British merchants formed a company called the Hudson Bay Company. They set up trading posts around the bay in hope of gaining some of the profitable fur trade. The two nations fought wars in the 1700s. As a result of a British victory in 1763, France was forced to give up much of its land in North America. However, the Quebec Act, passed by the British in 1774, gave French settlers in Canada the right to keep their language, religion, and system of laws. The next big change in Canada came in the 1700s and 1780s. When the American Revolution broke out, thousands of Americans remained loyal to Britain. During and after the war, many of them moved to Canada. Some settled in what are now the Atlantic provinces and others in modern Ontario. During the early 1800s, English and French communities disagreed over colonial government policies. Fear of U.S. takeover, however, forced them to work together. In 1867, the British colonies of Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick united as provinces of the Dominion of Canada. This new nation was a partly self-governing with the British Empire. Other territories would join Canada over the next 100 years. Let's take a look at that section from British Canada and answer our true and false questions. Number 4, during the 1600s and 1700s, France and England worked together to share the land in North America. That's going to be false because they were fierce competitors and they fought over the land. Number 5, many people loyal to Britain moved to Canada during the American Revolution. This is true because the American Revolution was the idea that in America they were going to fight against the British and stick it to England because they wanted their own country, their own independence. People who were loyal to England wanted to move back into an English territory, and the British or English were the ones that were controlling Canada at this time. Number 6, during the 1800s, the United States took over English and French communities and formed the country now called Canada. That's going to be false as well. English and French communities worked together and formed Canada. They called it the Dominion of Canada because they wanted to prevent a possible U.S. takeover. So this is false. During the 1800s, the United States took over English and French communities. We would say the English and French communities worked together. Number 7. Canada's leaders expanded westward toward the Pacific. We're going to read that in the next section on page 187. Canada's leaders began looking westward. They hoped to expand the nation all the way to the Pacific. In 1869, Canada gained the vast territory held by the Hudson Bay Company. Many Metis lived on some of this land. Metis are the children of French and native peoples. They wanted more say in governing themselves. The province of Manitoba was created to give them that chance. By this time, settlers had arrived in British Columbia on the Pacific coast. There they traded furs and searched for gold. The people of British Columbia agreed to join Canada in 1871. In the 1880s, Canadians built a transcontinental or continent-crossing railroad that united the eastern and western parts of the nation. Canada's leaders expanded westward toward the Pacific in the late 1800s. Number 7 is going to be true. Number 8, the province of Manitoba was created to encourage French and native people to live together. 8, that's going to be false in terms of encouraging them to live together. This was an effort for Manitoba being created to give Metis more say in governing themselves. These were the natives peoples and the natives and the French people's descendants that have a distinct culture because of that heritage. Number 9, Canada built a transcontinental railroad to unite the eastern and western parts of Canada. That is true. And number 10, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was originally formed to search for gold in the Yukon Territory. Let's finish this by reading the rest of page 187. Canada's leaders made agreements with some native peoples of the West. According to the government, the native peoples agreed to give up their lands in exchange for aid. Native people believed they gave settlers only the right to use the land for farming. Canada's westward expansion came at a price. New settlers pushed native peoples off their lands. In 1905, Saskatchewan and Alberta entered Canada as provinces. Meanwhile, gold had been discovered in the Yukon Territory, and this discovery led to a gold rush. Helping create order in the West was a police force that formed in 1873 called the Northwest Mounted Police. The group is known today as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So were these Royal Canadian Mounted Police hired or created to search for gold? No, it was created to have some semblance of government authority, because if you have this massive gold rush, people are going to be going out there to try and find gold, and they're probably willing to do whatever it takes to get this gold because that would be a way in which for them to get rich. So this is going to be false. The police are created to create order during the gold rush. You can imagine the type of criminal activity that would be sprouted from this because people wanted to get that gold no matter what the expense, no matter what the crime, that they were willing to kind of go through that. In the last section, we're going to answer the questions that are provided here. What I'd like you to do is read this section on your own and answer these questions appropriately. It says use your textbook to answer these questions about Canada grew in the 1900s. What you're going to look for here is the idea of Canadians' economic growth and immigration. Canada gained its independence in 1931 but had not gained complete freedom. Canada's population expanded as the government changed immigration laws, and Canada's industries boomed after World War II in part because of its many, many resources. So it's going to become this flourishing nation because of its independence, population growth, and the overall industry and economic activity that can come about. The Questions that you're going to be answering from this section is: what was the last territory to join Canada? How did Canada's economy change in the early 1900s? How did Canada's leader get more workers to support their growing industry? Number 4, what major changes took place in Canada in 1931 and 1982? And number 5, list 5 factors that helped Canada's industries to grow after World War II. So you're looking specifically in number 4 for 2 specific dates in your reading. In number 5, you're looking to list 5 different items that would have been helpful in terms of its industries growing. God's blessings on completing the rest of your assignment.